Greetings, folks, and welcome to our third little talk on Wuthering Heights. This one assumes that you've read to the end of chapter 27. The next and final one will assume that you've, of course, completed the entire book. As the third quarter of the novel, roughly, revolves around the life and development of Cathy and Edgar's daughter, Catherine, that will be the main focus of this talk as well. Catherine is, of course, an absolutely delightful character. I have been fond of her since the first time I encountered this book some 38 years ago. And the various relationships that revolve around her are all really interesting and unique relationships. The first of these, of course, is her relationship with her father, so that seems to be the logical place to begin. Before we talk about Catherine and Edgar, though, I think it's important that we talk about Catherine on her own terms. So let's take a look at the beginning of chapter 18 and the beginning of Catherine's life. The 12 years, continued Mrs. Dean, following that dismal period were the happiest of my life. My great troubles in their passage rose from our little lady's trifling illnesses, which she had to experience in common with all children, rich and poor. For the rest, after the first 6 months, she grew like a larch, and could walk and talk, too, in her own way, before the heath blossomed a second time over Mrs. Linton's dust. She was the most winning thing that ever brought sunshine into a desolate house. A real beauty in face, with the Earnshaw's handsome dark eyes, but the Linton's fair skin and small features, and yellow curling hair. Her spirit was high, though not rough, and qualified by a heart sensitive and lively to excess in its affections. That capacity for intense attachments reminded me of her mother. Still, she did not resemble her, for she could be soft and mild as a dove, and she had a gentle voice and pensive expression. Her anger was never furious, her love never fierce. It was deep and tender. However, it must be acknowledged she had faults to foil her gifts. A propensity to be saucy was one, and a perverse will that indulged children invariably acquire, whether they be good-tempered or cross. If a servant chanced to vex her, it was always, "I shall tell Papa," and if he reproved her, even by a look, you would have thought it a heart-breaking business. I don't believe he ever did speak a harsh word to her. And this is a wonderful piece of description, isn't it? And I'm going to continue with the passage in a few minutes, but first, let's just look at a couple of the details that Nellie brings up. Let's start with the image of young Catherine growing like a larch, in Nellie's words. You'll remember that when Heathcliff goes out to basically await the news of Cathy's death, he leans on a larch tree, which I think represents or symbolizes in some way Cathy, as we talked about last lecture, with its hot-burning wood and being the only conifer that sheds its needles. Well, we're also told that after Heathcliff leaves in that scene, and this is just the end of chapter 17, Cathy never regains consciousness. So she basically gives birth while already in sort of a liminal state, already half dead, sort of. And with Catherine and she sharing the same name, there is that sense that there's a passing of a common nature from one to the other. This common nature, I think, is reflected in young Catherine also being compared to a larch. The resonance of that tree in both cases binds the two together, I think, almost as securely as their names do. And let's face it, larches don't get a lot of love in literature. It's not like she's referring to an oak, and the minute somebody says an oak, you've got so many possible references that it's almost impossible to narrow the field down to what the writer might actually be talking about and what other works of literature or mythology they might be referring to. This is actually the only novel I know that gives any love to the poor, modest, fast-burning tamarack. And I'm going to make sure that that wonderful tree gets as much credit as it can. But now that I've milked this image for all it's worth, it's probably time to move on. The other detail, or little cluster of details I'd like to focus on for this little passage, is simply that Nellie identifies Catherine as a genuine blending of the natures of the Earnshaws and the Lintons. And in the entire novel, she is the only character who actually is a blending of the two. So we might really think of her as the figure around whom everything else kind of revolves, even though, for example, Heathcliff and Cathy might be more compelling, and Heathcliff really is probably the most memorable character in the book, and the most psychologically threatening. It is, as we'll see over the next couple of talks, in Catherine that the narrative most fully comes together. There's a sense in which in her the deficiencies on the one hand and excesses on the other of the respective families that go into making her up are reconciled and balanced to a really wonderful degree. As I said, I am very fond of Catherine as a character. I've always found her, of all of the characters in the book, probably to be the most approachable. And that impression seems to continue, or quite frankly to deepen, with each additional reading of the book. This is a very subjective take, I realize, but it's an honest one. But let's continue with Nellie's description, picking up where we left off with Catherine's relationship with Edgar. He took her education entirely on himself, and made it an amusement. Fortunately, curiosity and a quick intellect urged her into an apt scholar. She learned rapidly and eagerly, and did honor to his teaching. Till she reached the age of 13, she had not once been beyond the range of the park by herself. Mr. Linton would take her with him a mile or so outside on rare occasions, but he trusted her to no one else. Gimmerton was an unsubstantial name in her ears. The chapel, the only building she had approached or entered, except her own home. Wuthering Heights and Mr. Heathcliff did not exist for her. She was a perfect recluse, and apparently perfectly contented. Sometimes, indeed, while surveying the country from her nursery window, she would observe, "Ellen, how long will it be before I can walk to the top of those hills? I wonder what lies on the other side. Is it the sea?" "No, Miss Cathy," I would answer. "It is hills again, just like these." "And what are those golden rocks like when you stand under them?" she once asked. The abrupt descent of Penistone Crags particularly attracted her notice, especially when the setting sun shone on it, and the topmost heights, and the whole extent of landscape besides, lay in shadow. I explained that they were bare masses of stone with hardly enough earth in their clefts to nourish a stunted tree. And while Nellie is not a particularly reliable narrator, I'm going to skip over that bit for now and just focus on the Catherine Edgar stuff. And I do have to say that of all the relationships in the book, I think I might really kind of like Catherine and Edgar's the best. This too, of course, is very subjective, so I'll just say why. Edgar's a great dad. I mean, seriously, and I'm speaking here as a dad, as a single dad of an only daughter who is 13 years old and with whom I'm very close. So I can't read this this relationship objectively. I've always loved it. I always have. But this time around, I think I'm loving it even more than I ever have. As for why this is such a wonderful relationship, it's, each of them becomes the other's world in, I think, a very healthy way. Edgar simultaneously expands and limits Catherine's world in, I think, exactly the way that he should. He functions simultaneously as teacher and protector. And in this sense, I think we need to hold him up in comparison with Hindley, who fails utterly in both of those capacities, where Hareton is concerned, even when he's still alive. Where Hindley ultimately is lost in his own despair, in his own obsessions, his own unfulfilled needs, really, his bottomless unfulfilled needs. Edgar is capable of looking out of himself and directing his attention, directing his energy where it's needed. Hindley never rises to that. And also, unlike Hindley, Edgar is, like his father, a magistrate, a person committed to the rule of law, to the public good. His attention there is directed not at his own interests, but at the interests of those who need to benefit from his abilities, which seem to be considerable. But I'm digressing again. This seems to be a bit of a digressy lecture. I hope that's okay. It's probably a good idea also to think about, on the one hand, why Catherine is so sheltered, and on the other, on Nellie's interpretation, Nellie's presentation of her, regarding her own limitations and her curiosity. And maybe think of some places, if we can find any, where Nellie's description or interpretation of Catherine's actions may not line up exactly with Catherine herself. I say this because, of course, Nellie's a biased narrator. She likes certain people better than others, and she raised Catherine. She is the closest thing Catherine has to a mother, very much as she is also the closest thing that Hareton has to a mother, and until she's forced to come down to the Grange when Cathy marries Edgar. If there are two characters toward whom, or in favor of whom, Nellie's going to be biased, it will be Catherine and Hareton. But as for Catherine and her response to both her education and her limits, she seems in Nellie's telling to respond pretty well and quite realistically, I think, to both. Catherine doesn't have the exaggerated passions of Cathy. Those passions are still there, as Nellie points out, but they're mitigated by the Linton side of her character. Yet at the same time, she is an apt student in the academic sense. Because, of course, Edgar's a good teacher. And unlike Joseph, who is the only teacher that Cathy seems to have, he teaches her things that are worth knowing. Not things intended to convict her of her own sinfulness, but things intended to enrich her mind. And she does seem to have a genuinely receptive and active and curious mind. And I guess this is where Penistone Crags come in. We haven't really heard that much about Penistone Crags, have we? This is an important distinction. This is an important turning point, I think, in the novel, where there's this emphasis on this area that hasn't been emphasized before. Catherine isn't drawn to Wuthering Heights. She's ignorant of Wuthering Heights. But what she's drawn to is a place that's further away than the Heights, the actual pinnacle of the moors in the Yorkshire of the novel. And it seems to be both the roughness and the goldenness, the lightness of it that attracts her. It's a wonderful combination of two appeals, isn't it? And of course, her attraction to the moors definitely anchors her in her mother's world, emotionally, spiritually. This is where she's drawn to. While at the same time, as Nellie says, her life, her world has existed of nothing but Thrushcross Park, a walled-in, sheltered area that is, aside from the chapel, all she knows. And here I think narrative location or perspective matters a great deal. In the narrative of the Cathy Heathcliff Edgar generation, the place, the point of reference, was Wuthering Heights, and the Grange was this place down, not on the moors, closer to civilization. But as it wasn't the place where the key characters or principal characters lived, it also wasn't the place whose values were the values by which the world was assessed. That was Wuthering Heights. So we talked, I think, in the first lecture about how the Linton children are presented, for example, by Heathcliff as being beneath contempt because they're weak and they're petty and they're, normal kids. When we take a look at the third quarter of the book, our point of reference or our place from which we're looking, so I guess our perspective, is the Grange. So the perspectives have reversed. So we're no longer looking down on the Grange and the village. We're looking up toward Wuthering Heights and the crags. And in looking up, in not being there, but seeing there as a place that can be aspired to, a place that can be the object of curiosity, that can lure one up into its bleakness. I think perhaps some of the beauty of the area, of the setting, and maybe even the appropriateness of the characters to the setting become a little more apparent. The extreme point of the moors and Wuthering Heights itself become imbued with a sense of mystery that they didn't have before. But here as well, we run into problems, and perhaps even it's a problem of, at least partly, Edgar's creation, as much as I really do like the guy. Edgar's done his best to protect Catherine from the threats that he knows are up there. But the one thing he hasn't done is tell her anything about it. He'll go a few miles from home, or a couple of miles from home, so about halfway to the heights, and that's the limit of her exposure to the moors. He won't let her go there by herself, and again, this is perfectly reasonable given the danger that he knows is lurking there, and that if you've read to the end of chapter 27, you also know is lurking there. But what he doesn't do, or at least what we have no evidence that he does, and given that he only exists in the book, we have to assume that he doesn't do it, is tell her why she can't go there, why she shouldn't go there. And here, I wonder, I'm genuinely confused. Does he underestimate her character? Does he underestimate her capacity to understand danger? Well, maybe because she's never experienced danger, and that's the kind of thing that you don't understand until you experience it. But at the same time, he's left the possibility of this golden glow of Penistone Crags to draw Catherine out at the first opportunity. So much for Nellie's assertion that she was perfectly comfortable within her limits. Of course she wasn't fucking comfortable within her limits. She's a normal, healthy 13-year-old girl. She wants to explore the world. And at the first opportunity she does, even deploying a little bit of deception to do so. But if we want to read her curiosity more broadly, and I think we should, I think it's worth noting that as soon as Edgar's authority is withdrawn, as soon as that Linton side is taken away, or really as soon as that veneer of civilization is taken away, she's immediately drawn to the rougher, more natural, not enclosed world of the crags, of the moors, a world without walls, a world where she at least would appear to be freer to roam, and probably would be, if not for the monster huddling there at the heights. And I use the term monster advisedly. And because Edgar, who understands the monster, fails to warn his daughter about the monster, he leaves her vulnerable to him. This is probably his only mistake. But wow, it's a doozy. Because it fails to account for something that maybe Edgar can't quite understand, and something that he could never quite understand in Kathy either. That we are creatures of impulse, that we are not by nature creatures who live enclosed by walls and imagine that those walls are enough, whether they be the walls of a park, the walls of a garden, or the walls of a church. And of course, the impulse to not be enclosed is bound up with the desire for knowledge, one of those other more deeply human things. On the topic of Penistone Crags, let's just continue with the conversation that Nellie and Catherine have. And then we'll move on, of course, to Hareton. "Oh, you've been on them?" she cried gleefully. "Then I can go too when I'm a woman. Has Papa been, Ellen?" "Papa would tell you, miss," I answered hastily, "that they are not worth the trouble of visiting. The moors where you ramble with him are much nicer, and Thrushcross Park is the finest place in the world." "But I know the park, and I don't know those," she murmured to herself, "and I should delight to look around me from the brow of that tallest point. My little pony, Minnie, shall take me sometime." One of the maids, mentioning the fairy caves, quite turned her head, and the desire to fulfill this project. She teased Mr. Linton about it, and he promised she should have the journey when she got older, but Miss Catherine measured her age by months, and "Now am I old enough to go to Penistone Crags?" was the constant question in her mouth. The road thither wound close by Wuthering Heights. Edgar had not the heart to pass it, so she received this constant answer, "Not yet, love, not yet." And here there are a few interesting details, aren't there? One is the appeal of the unknown. Catherine wants to know the top of the crags simply because she doesn't know them yet. This is natural, normal, I would say admirable, quite frankly. If we're not drawn to things beyond the limits of our knowledge, there's a genuine deficiency in us. And this deficiency is part of what we see in Linton, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But it also comes with a danger, doesn't it? The known is usually safe, and if not safe, at least navigable most of the time. The unknown is a mystery, and mystery is appealing. It's something that drives us. The desire to solve it drives us, rather. Or if not to solve it, at least to encounter it directly and for ourselves. And as I said, we would be, I think, deficient without that urge, which of course also is kind of the urge that got Adam and Eve in trouble in the Genesis myth. Nonetheless, that I think is a good thing in our character. And by good, to be clear, I don't mean morally good, I simply mean healthy. It's what distinguishes people who are sheep from people of genuine spirit. And as long as we're on the topic of that particular mythology, once again we have that fairy narrative creeping in, don't we? That folktale narrative. One of the maids mentions a fairy cave up on Penistone Crags, bringing in local lore of the supernatural, local lore of fairy creatures. And yeah, again, what person of spirit wouldn't want to go there and explore those? But also, this brings her into alignment with not just Cathy, but Heathcliff. This brings her into sort of a frustrated alignment with a facet of the world that she hasn't had the chance to experience yet. And again, this is probably a failing on Edgar's part, hasn't been adequately informed of, so has no idea of its very real dangers. Speaking of dangers, of course, the description has the road passing by, the road to Penistone Crags passing by Wuthering Heights. And this, of course, is, in a matter of realistic geography, perfectly sensible. There's not that many roads on the high moors. But also, symbolically, I think, it matters a great deal. The road to achieving our knowledge of the unknown, no matter how golden it may be lit, no matter how beautiful, and no matter how crawling with fairies, which is a good thing, it's going to always lead by Wuthering Heights metaphorically, isn't it? It's going to involve some danger. And that danger can be quite genuine both physically and psychologically, spiritually. But here as well, I think we have a nice inversion. You remember when Cathy had her dream that she had gone to heaven and got kicked out of heaven because she didn't belong there and wound up on the moors and crying for joy because she was back where she belonged. At that time, she also said she had no more business marrying Edgar than she did in being in heaven. This associates Thrushcross Grange with heaven, and we've already got the Edenic imagery that we talked about last time in there, so this is fairly consistent in the novel. This is not projection on my part. But here, as with what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, this is another inversion of perspective, isn't it? This is Catherine in many ways sort of Kathy 2.0, a sort of extension of her character, symbolically speaking, looking from the point of view of that place that Kathy compared to heaven and realizing it's not enough. So within this very kind of homey dialogue of a child wanting to explore her world in the most natural and healthy way, we also have a dialogue addressing the insufficiency of the worldview that puts up the walls. But on that note, we haven't even finished with chapter 18 yet, and we really need to move on to Hareton. But what do we say about Hareton? Well, for one thing, his name is important, just as Catherine's name is important. You may remember that when Lockwood goes to Wuthering Heights, he sees the name Hareton Earnshaw and the date 1500 carved on the stone above the door. So the house itself dates to a time just when England is emerging from the Middle Ages into the early modern world. And the name associated with it, the founder of the house, literally of the house, is Hareton. So just as Catherine is, by her name and also by her association with the large, a continuation of the nature or an expression of the nature that we first see embodied in Cathy, we can also read young Hareton as a continuation or an embodiment of the nature of the person who founded the house. The distance of ancestry, of course, is considerable, but the pattern itself is actually remarkably consistent. But why does it matter? And here, I think, as with Catherine, there's a sense, a strong implication anyway, that Hareton embodies something that is essential to the Earnshaws, to the house both as an edifice and as a family. Somehow, I think, the Earnshaws have come to be distilled in Hareton. But what exactly does that mean? And for that, I think we need to take a look at both his physicality and the natural impulses that seem to arise from his character prior to or outside of the corrupting influence of Heathcliff. He is, of course, physically robust, as all of the Earnshaws are, and as is really appropriate for a family both practically and symbolically associated with the land. He is physically where he should be. It's just that he's been displaced by the usurper Heathcliff. But the appropriateness of his physicality to the place, the location of his birthright, is apparent. He, though acting in the capacity of a servant, still does do the work of maintaining the farm, of maintaining that active relationship between the family and the land. And though consciously degraded by Heathcliff, both socially and intellectually, he still maintains a spontaneous good nature. And to see that, I think we need to take a look at how he and Catherine get along. When we first see them together, in chapter 18, of course, back when they're young, they seem to actually be getting along fairly well. Catherine, as the healthy, normal, chattery 13-year-old that she is babbling away at her older cousin, whom she doesn't know to be her cousin Hareton, who's 5 years her senior, and he's just kind of gawking at her, wondering what the hell she's going on about. This is normal. This is actually perfectly normal, and he seems to be genuinely curious about her and positively inclined toward her. In fact, it turns out that Hareton had spontaneously offered to see her safely home over the moors. There is, though, obviously some awkwardness between them, and all of this really of Heathcliff's making, even though he's not actually there, as we see as the scene unfolds. And here I think I'd like to read a bit. I picked up her hat and approached to reinstate it, but perceiving that the people of the house took her part, she commenced capering around the room, and on my giving chase ran like a mouse over and under and behind the furniture, rendering it ridiculous for me to pursue. Hareton and the woman laughed, and she joined them, and waxed more impertinent still, till I cried in great agitation, "Well, Miss Cathy, if you were aware of whose house this is, you'd be glad enough to get out." "It's your father's house, isn't it?" she said, turning to Hareton. "Nay," he replied, looking down and blushing bashfully. He could not stand the steady gaze of her eyes, though they were just his own. "Whose, then? Your master's?" she asked. He colored deeper, with a different feeling, muttered an oath, and turned away. "Who is the master?" continued the tiresome girl, appealing to me. "He talked about our house and our folk. I thought he had been the owner's son. And he never said, 'Miss.' He should have done, shouldn't he, if he's a servant?" Hareton grew black as a thundercloud at this childish speech. I silently shook my questioner, and at last succeeded in equipping her for departure. "Now, get my horse," she said, addressing her unknown kinsman, as she would one of the stable boys at the Grange. "And you may come with me. I want to see where the goblin hunter rises in the marsh, and to hear about the farishes, as you call them. But make haste. What's the matter? Get my horse, I say." "I'll see thee damned before I be thy servant," growled the lad. "You'll see me what?" asked Catherine, surprised. "Damned, thou saucy witch," he replied. "There, Miss Cathy. You see, you've got into pretty company," I interposed. "Nice words to be using to a young lady. Pray, don't begin to dispute with him. Come, let us seek for Minnie ourselves, and be gone." "But, Ellen," cried she, staring, fixed in astonishment, "how dare he speak to me? Mustn't he be made to do as I ask him? You wicked creature, I shall tell Papa what you said. Now then." Hareton did not appear to feel this threat, so the tears sprung into her eyes with indignation. "You bring the pony," she exclaimed, turning to the woman, "and let my dogs free this moment." "Softly, miss," answered the addressed. "You'll lose nothing by being civil. Though Mr. Hareton there be not the master's son, he is your cousin, and I was never hired to serve you." "He, my cousin?" cried Cathy, with a scornful laugh. "Yes, indeed," responded the reprover. "Oh, Ellen, don't let them say such things," she pursued in great trouble. "Papa has gone to fetch my cousin from London. My cousin is a gentleman's son, and my—" She stopped and wept outright, upset at the bare notion of relationship with such a clown. "Hush, hush," I whispered. "People can have many cousins, and of all sorts, Miss Cathy, without being any the worse for it, only they needn't keep their company, if they be disagreeable and bad. He's not my cousin, Ellen," she went on, gathering fresh grief from reflection, and flinging herself into my arms for refuge from the idea. I was much vexed at her and the servant for their mutual revelations, having no doubt of Linton's approaching arrival, communicated by the former being reported to Mr. Heathcliff, and feeling as confident that Catherine's first thought on her father's return would be to seek an explanation of the latter's assertion concerning her rude-bred kindred. And we'll stop here for now and see about what we just read. One thing worth noting is that their eyes are described as being the same. That is, there's this visual indication that the two of them actually share the same nature. And initially they do seem to be, as I said, favorably inclined toward each other. So the affinity there goes certainly well beyond appearance and crosses over into character. This affinity actually is also carried through in their mutual interest in fairies. It's the idea of seeing the fairy caves that is at least one of the reasons why Catherine sneaks out of the Grange and heads up toward Penistone Crags, and Hareton, it turns out, has knowledge of what he calls farishes, just that's a dialect word for fairies, so there's an inclination in outlook that the two of them share as well, and that they both share with Cathy. And from this alone, I think you get the impression that absent the social corruption that we see emanating from Heathcliff, the two of them would probably quite spontaneously have become very good friends. But of course, the corruption doesn't come entirely from Heathcliff, does it? Catherine's notions about who's the servant and who's the master are, of course, entirely culturally constructed. She's imbibed these whole cloth because for her entire life, her entire effectively cloistered life, she's never had them challenged. So she naturally assumes what many in the aristocracy did, and I would say probably do assume when we take a look at our modern aristocracies, that they are different in kind from the people who serve them, from the people who work for them. And this is, I think, one of the inevitable results of Catherine's sheltered upbringing. That on the one hand, she of course doesn't know the landscape outside of her very sheltered little existence. But on the other, she also doesn't have any idea of people outside of that context. The only basis for relationship that she has is the basis that she's learned at the Grange, where there is a single authority figure, namely her father, and whose authority she can effectively wield by proxy to at least a limited degree. We see this with the threat, "I'll tell my daddy," basically, as if the threat of angering Edgar should be of any concern to anyone outside the Grange. And here, of course, the other servant is very helpful, isn't she? Because she highlights the fact that the lord-servant relationship is one of employment. It's contractual and has nothing to do with the quality of persons involved. And being a servant to one person who is at least occupying the social space of an aristocrat does not incline one to be a servant to all people who occupy that social space, which seems to be what Catherine has in mind. Because, of course, again, as I said, it's all she's really ever known. And the kindred nature of Catherine and Hareton work in an interesting way here as well, don't they? Because one of them is in the presumed master position, from her own point of view, and one of them is in the presumed servant position, again, from that master point of view, and yet they're of the same nature. I think Bronte here is drawing attention specifically to the social constructedness of these relations. Catherine has a sense of worth that seems to derive largely from her position of privilege. Hareton, on the other hand, though socially and intellectually degraded, still has an innate sense of his own worth, and this puts him, I think, ahead of Catherine in this regard. But before we move on from this section here, I think we should also just draw attention to a couple of more Hareton-related passages in chapter 18. Nellie says, for example, "Still, I thought I could detect in his physiognomy a mind owning better qualities than his father ever possessed, good things lost amid a wilderness of weeds, to be sure, whose rankness far overtopped their neglected growth, yet, notwithstanding, evidence of a wealthy soil that might yield luxuriant crops under other and favorable circumstances. Mr. Heathcliff, I believe, had not treated him physically ill, thanks to his fearless nature, which offered no temptation to that course of oppression. It had none of the timid susceptibility that would have given zest to ill treatment in Heathcliff's judgment." So here we see Nellie recognizing the innate worth of Hareton, despite the adverse situation in which he finds himself. And I really sometimes wish I could teach this book in conjunction with my favorite Chinese philosopher, Mengzi, because there's a wonderful passage in his book, dated to about 4th century BC, that describes exactly Hareton's situation, that a nature blighted by adverse circumstances can come to look like a nature that has nothing to offer, that has no worth, but that we can't therefore attribute worthlessness to it, and we can't mistake its apparent debased condition to be its actual nature. I think this is true of Hareton, and I think it's also true of Heathcliff. But onward, this is not a talk in Chinese philosophy. Mary, specifically, that was for your benefit, and of course I was talking about Ox Mountain. Another Hareton passage that may be worth having in mind, though, as we move on and move beyond this first of the several chapters that I asked you to read, now that we're more than halfway through what I'd anticipated being the entire length of the lecture, we're told that Hareton actually did take Catherine up to Penistone Crags and show her around. He opened the mysteries of the fairy cave and 20 other queer places, but being in disgrace, I was not favored with a description of the interesting objects she saw. So here again, we see Hareton's favorable inclination toward Catherine and their joint interest in the same kind of thing, their joint attraction to the same far reaches outside of the constraints of society or civilization. They're desiring to be in the wilds and reach for not the authority of the myth that guides the Grange, but the poetic truth, you might say, of the myth that imbues the moors and the crags. Fairies, for both of them, have more appeal than saints. And that, I believe, is as it should be. And this in turn anchors them both, I think, in the spiritual space that in the previous generation had been occupied by Cathy and Heathcliff. And that is also occupied incidentally in Jane Eyre by both Jane and Rochester. But now I suppose we should probably say something about Cousin Weaselbritches and how he fits the thematic architecture of the poem. If we can see both Catherine and Hareton as embodying the best of their particular ancestry, the best of their parentage, then we can see Linton very clearly as embodying the worst of his. And here again, names matter. Hareton, as we were talking about, bears the name of the founder of the Earnshaw dynasty, if you want to call it that. Catherine is an extension of her mother, of Cathy, and as we've discussed, this is borne out in more than merely the names. Linton, as well, bears the name of his lineage. His mother chose the name Linton to consciously exclude Heathcliff, to have him be only a Linton. And to some degree she succeeded, but not in the way she probably hoped. Linton is pale and frail, and seems to actually embody the genuine pettiness of character that Heathcliff uncharitably attributed to both Isabella and Edgar when he observed the behavior in the Grange when they were children. That is, if Hareton is a distillation of the best that the Earnshaws have to offer, then Linton seems to be a distillation of the worst of the Lintons, with some nasty Heathcliff bits thrown in for good measure, or bad measure, or, well, just for measure, I suppose. To illustrate the point, let's just take a look at a couple of early passages describing him. These are from chapter 19. And we'll start with Catherine's reaction to him. "Linton is just 6 months younger than I am," she chattered, as we strolled leisurely over the swells and hollows of mossy turf under shadow of the trees. "How delightful it will be to have him for a playfellow. Aunt Isabella sent Papa a beautiful lock of his hair. It was lighter than mine, more flaxen, and quite fine. I have it carefully preserved in a little glass box, and I've often thought what a pleasure it would be to see its owner. Oh, I'm happy, and Papa, dear, dear Papa. Come, Ellen, let's run. Come, run." This, of course, is just as the coach is pulling up, and Edgar is arriving with his nephew. We'll skip down a bit and get to the first impressions. While they were exchanging caresses, I took a peep to see after Linton. He was asleep in a corner, wrapped in a warm, fur-lined cloak, as if it had been winter, a pale, delicate, effeminate boy, who might have been taken for my master's younger brother, so strong was the resemblance, but there was a sickly peevishness in his aspect that Edgar Linton never had. And just for the sake of not taking up too much more of your folks' time on this, these are probably the only passages, descriptive passages, of Linton that I'm going to get into. I'm sure you all have your favorites, and I use the term loosely, but these I think will do the job for our purposes. As I said, they posit Linton as the distillation of the worst of his family. So now we need to think about why this makes sense. Why would Linton be as he is given the narrative logic of the novel. And I think there are a few reasons. The extreme fairness of his hair, for example, is a good indication that what he is something at the heart, at the essential core of the Linton lineage. But as I said, not in its best, but rather in its worst form. And I find the image of Catherine keeping that lock of his hair under glass to be poetically really resonant. It's a wonderful picture of enclosure, isn't it? The Lintons are enclosed. They live behind walls. They live inside the artificial structures set up by society. And as in the case of Edgar, this can be a genuinely honorable way of living. He is a public person. He's a conscientious person. So I don't say this as a disparagement. But in Linton's case, I do. Because Linton is, as I said, the extreme. And here we need to think about where he comes from. There's this weird pattern in the novel, and I don't know if you've noticed it. It's been kind of circling around my own lockdown-addled noggin for a while now. And that is the arrivals of Heathcliff and Linton parallel, or rather reflect each other, in some really important ways. Heathcliff is brought in from the outside. He's brought in from Liverpool. Well, fine, let's move it forward a generation. His son, Linton, is brought in from London. And each is brought in by the father, the authority figure, in their respective houses. I'll have more to say about their reflection of each other in a moment, because this is a wonderful example of that Gothic doubling motif. For now, though, I'd like to focus on Linton and London. As I said, he is enclosed. He's from the biggest city in the world at the time, and I'm not exaggerating. So where he is fair and pale and physically slight, as all of the Lintons are, Edgar and Catherine, for example, at least have the benefit of being near the moors. They're, if not living in or up close to nature, because they spend a lot of their time behind walls and enclosed, as we were talking about, but their skies are open. Their environment is not crowded by the atmosphere, by the sounds and the sights of the biggest city in the world. They breathe the air that comes down off of the heath. You can't do that in London, especially in the London that was in the process of being transformed by the Industrial Revolution. This was not a healthy place to be. And this is where Linton is from. This is where he was born, even though his lineage is from this area, from the dramatic center of action. He himself is from London. And the sickliness of him, well, it does a couple of jobs, but one of them, I think, is to give us a nice illustration of what that Linton nature, that physically slight, enclosed nature is like when it's exposed or when it's raised in the soil of an urban rather than a rural or idyllically rural environment. And here we're working with basic romanticism, which, as we were talking about the other day, clearly privileges the rural over the urban and gives both a moral weight that at times, and we see this in conversations between Lockwood and Nellie, can be a little bit naive. Lockwood buys into the romantic idealization of the rural, and, well, Life at the Heights kind of calls bullshit on that, doesn't it? But even so, the physical healthiness of the environment is not to be ignored, and that's completely missing in Linton's background. I don't want to dwell too much on that because I don't think that's the main reason why London matters here. I think rather that London parallels, or rather reflects, Liverpool. But to get into why that is, we need to look at Heathcliff's language when Nellie deposits Linton at the Heights, as per Heathcliff's legally binding demand. Before he dismounted, I went and opened the door. It was 6:30. The family had just finished breakfast. The servant was clearing and wiping down the table. Joseph stood by his master's chair, telling some tale concerning a lame horse, and Hareton was preparing for the hayfield. "Hello, Nellie," cried Mr. Heathcliff when he saw me. "I feared I should have to come down and fetch my property myself. You've brought it, have you? Let us see what we can make of it." He got up and strode to the door. Hareton and Joseph followed in gaping curiosity. Poor Linton ran a frightened eye over the faces of the three. "Surely," said Joseph after a grave inspection, "he's swapped wi' ye, maister, and yon's his lass." Heathcliff, having stared his son into an ague of confusion, uttered a scornful laugh. "God, what a beauty! What a lovely, charming thing!" he exclaimed. "Haven't they reared it on snails and sour milk, Nellie? Oh, damn my soul, but that's worse than I expected, and the devil knows I was not sanguine." I bid the trembling and bewildered child get down and enter. He did not thoroughly comprehend the meaning of his father's speech, or whether it were intended for him. Indeed, he was not yet certain that the grim, sneering stranger was his father, but he clung to me with growing trepidation, and on Mr. Heathcliff taking a seat and bidding him come hither, he hid his face on my shoulder and wept. "Tut, tut," said Heathcliff, stretching out a hand and dragging him roughly between his knees, and then holding up his head by the chin. "None of that nonsense. We're not going to hurt thee, Linton. Isn't that thy name? Thou'rt thy mother's child entirely. Where's my share in thee, puling chicken?" He took off the boy's cap and pushed back his thick flaxen curls, felt his slender arms and his small fingers, during which examination Linton ceased crying and lifted his great blue eyes to inspect the inspector. "Do you know me?" asked Heathcliff, having satisfied himself that the limbs were all equally frail and feeble. "No," said Linton with a gaze of vacant fear. "You've heard of me, I dare say?" "No," he replied again. "No? What a shame of your mother never to waken your filial regard for me. You're my son, then, I tell you, and your mother was a wicked slut to leave you in ignorance of the sort of father you possessed. Now, don't wince and colour up, though it is something to see you've not white blood. Be a good lad, and I'll do for you. Nellie, if you be tired, you may sit down. If not, get home again. I guess you'll report what you hear and see to the cipher at the Grange, and this thing won't be settled while you linger about it." "Well," replied I hope you'll be kind to the boy, Mr. Heathcliff, or you'll not keep him long, and he's all you have akin in the wide world that you'll ever know, remember." "I'll be very kind to him, you needn't fear," he said, laughing. "Only nobody else must be kind to him. I'm jealous of monopolizing his affection. And to begin my kindness, Joseph, bring the lad some breakfast. Hareton, you infernal calf, begone to your work. Yes, Nell," he added, when they were departed, "my son is prospective owner of your place, and I should not wish him to die till I was certain of being his successor. Besides, he's mine, and I want the triumph of seeing my descendant fairly lord of their estates, my child hiring their children to till their father's lands for wages. That is the sole consideration which can make me endure the whelp. I despise him for himself, and hate him for the memories he revives. But that consideration is sufficient. He's safe with me, and shall be tended as carefully as your master tends his own." And okay, there are a few details that I'd like to consider here. One, the obvious. Heathcliff's use of such words as it, thing, property. You may remember that when Heathcliff is first brought to Wuthering Heights, Nellie, in recollecting the scene, describes him as an it many times over. So the language of objectification, of seeing this visibly different, visibly incongruous figure as a thing rather than as a fellow creature, is common between those two scenes. But here it's Heathcliff, who had been the it, now using the language of thinginess, I guess we can say, to describe his own son. But there's more to it than that. Nell doesn't refer to Heathcliff as property. Heathcliff asserts ownership. So he takes the thingy language that initially described him and pushes it to its logical extreme. If a person is a thing, a person can be owned. And this is how he sees Linton. And this, by the way, is why I think we need to hold London and Liverpool up against each other. And to think about why those two particular cities may matter, after London, Liverpool at the time the novel is set was the most important city in Britain. It was, as I said before, a major port and was the busiest port on the west coast of Britain. Moreover, again, as I mentioned in the first lecture, much of the wealth that flowed into Britain, specifically through Liverpool, flowed in as a result of the slave trade. A number of firms that traded in slaves had their offices there. This is something with which the city of Liverpool is currently actually trying to come to grips. There was, for example, a statue of a major figure in the city, Edward Colston, a slave trader, that was thrown into the harbor during the global Black Lives Matter protests this past spring. And it's not as if the city is currently trying to hide its involvement in slavery. They've set up a slavery museum. They are trying to confront their history. But what does this have to do with London, and what does it have to do with Linton? And here, color matters. Heathcliff, as we've said before, is the racially ambiguous other. Dark not from any specific ethnicity, but dark simply as an indication that he is not white. This is at a time when British sailors and soldiers were in the process of conquering lands on multiple continents and dispossessing people who were not white of their birthright of authority over their own lands. I mean, shit, the book is published in 1847. The first Opium War was fought in 1842. This was the first drug war in which the British, who won the war, were the drug pushers, and that's how they fucking got Hong Kong, as a port through which they could channel opium from India into China, knowing damn well that the Chinese government didn't want it coming in. And then the Western powers had the gall to add insult to injury by constructing a stereotype associating Chinese culture with opium use, because the English wanted to trade opium for fucking tea. But that's not what I'm supposed to be talking about. I'm supposed to be talking about Wuthering Heights, and to return to the book and what I was getting at before I got off on my China digression, Heathcliff refers to Linton as his property. Well, as the non-white other, in a narrative set before the abolition of the slave trade in the empire, of all people in the novel who would run the risk of being property or be associated with the commodification of human beings from the commodities point of view, it would be Heathcliff. And here I need to talk about some very unpleasant things. One of the fates to which women held in slavery were subjected, I believe more often than not, was, of course, sexual assault. Or, sorry, I put too civil a name on it, rape. And we saw how Heathcliff treats Isabella before she runs away, didn't we? He is physically abusive to her, he humiliates her, and there are ample hints in his discourse that there are other things he gets up to that Bronte simply couldn't print for a Victorian audience. When he says to Nellie, for example, in chapter 14, "Tell your master, Nellie, that I never in all my life met with such an abject thing as she is. She even disgraces the name of Linton, and I've sometimes relented from pure lack of invention in my experiments on what she could endure, and still creep shamefully cringing back." So we need to read through the very articulate silence here. Bronte is giving us, I think, as grisly a picture of what Isabella was subjected to as she actually could, and still have her book ever make it to the bookshops. And the result of whatever happens between Heathcliff and Isabella is Linton, the whitest of white people in the book. Now, it still gets worse. When a child was born to a slave mother, an enslaved mother, regardless of who the father of the child was, the child remained a slave. The child followed what was called the condition of the mother. That's an American term, but it also applied in other jurisdictions. I'm just more familiar with the American terminology. That is, slave owners throughout the slave trading world would rape their enslaved women, get them pregnant, and then sell the children. That is, they would make their own human commodities with their human commodities. And when Heathcliff refers to Linton as it and his property, knowing this history, that makes my blood run cold. Not because it's happening to a white person, because it should never happen to any person, but because it's happening at all. And Heathcliff is so frank about it, so matter of fact. It's as though the legacy of slavery in the country that made more money than any other country in Europe on that trade is coming home to roost. And in that sense, while you can pity the characters, you can pity Isabella, you can pity Linton, you can't pity Britain. They brought it on themselves. That is, in the mid-19th century when this book was written, the British Empire had recently abolished slavery and was attempting to enforce a ban on the transatlantic slave trade because they were pretty good with boats. But of course, that big country on the other side of the Atlantic had yet to abolish slavery and were about to fight a war over the subject. And Bronte could not help but be aware, this is obvious given where she has Heathcliff coming from in the first place, that slavery is a live political issue at the time, and that the practices that I've just talked to you about were quite common in slave jurisdictions. And something else that was quite common at the time was, of course, racial anxiety. We talked about this a bit with Jane Eyre and Rochester's connection with the Caribbean and his wife Bertha, who was also of mixed and ambiguous race. The notion of a non-white person asserting authority where white people had held authority before would have given a lot of contemporary English people the willies. And the threat of a non-white other not just taking authority, but manipulating white people as if they were slaves would also, I think, create a genuine unease in much of Bronte's original readership. I think that's what it's supposed to do. I'm thinking, of course, although this hadn't been written at the time, of Nietzsche's wonderful line in Beyond Good and Evil, when you gaze into the abyss also gazes into you. Well, Heathcliff's the abyss, and he's not just gazing back, he's amassing land. And we see towards the end of the part of the conversation with Nellie that I read to you, his plan is simply to arrange things such that he is able to gain control of Thrushcross Grange, again, using his son Linton merely as a piece in a game, as a thing to be traded in order to obtain a better thing. He is quite literally trading his son for what he hopes to be Edward's property. More on that, of course, in our final lecture. For now, though, on that very unsettling topic, I think, of there being a sort of a slave narrative set in the heart of Yorkshire, I should probably call it a day or call it a night. This last part of the talk took a bit of a turn that I wasn't planning on, and of course this means there were other things that I was planning on that aren't going to be in it, but we have one more talk left, and we have, of course, the tutorial on Friday, which I'm very much looking forward to as always. So for now, just please continue reading, have the book finished for this Friday's tutorial. The next lecture, our final one on Wuthering Heights, will assume that you've read the whole thing. Thank you very much for listening. Bye for now.